Hello, welcome to the Big Strategy Podcast. I'm your host and fellow strategist, Jeff Hyatt. This is your go-to spot for real talk with the masterminds of business strategy. It's about sharing stories, insights, and those little nuggets of wisdom to help you unlock big growth. Let's turn the key and spring into action.
Welcome, everyone. Today, I have the honor of being joined by Daria Burke, author of the very inspirational and vulnerable, my words, memoir of my own making. And it's really struck me as a story of resilience, and not only that we can survive, but that we can also thrive by becoming more self-aware. And I know that may not be what the listeners always get on the Big Strategy Podcast, but in this case, business is clearly impacted by who we are and what we bring to the table as individuals. And so I think this is an important conversation to have. So Daria, it's been a while in the making. I know you've got incredible press about this book, but also just incredible personal growth through this. So I'm honored to have you and share in all of this.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here. I'm excited for our chat.
Yeah, thank you. Well, for those who may be new to this whole idea of kind of self-exploration, and a lot of clients that I advise, if you will, executives, they view that vulnerability almost as a fatal flaw. And your book clearly shows that vulnerability became a defining value or a defining strength of yours. And so maybe we can start there with that person who might be viewing openness as a weakness or a vulnerability.
Sure. I wish I could say that I'd paved the way for this conversation. Fortunately, we've had an incredible woman by the name of Brené Brown, who I think has done such an incredible job of spotlighting the ways in which shame and vulnerability hinder us from expansion, I would say, in general. And one of my favorite quotes is from Seneca. So it's a very old one, this idea that no one was ever wise by chance. And I think if knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom, that starts with telling the truth. So I appreciate you saying that my book was vulnerable, and I've heard it be described as well as raw. And the truth is that we're all really good at lying to ourselves.
Yes, and others.
And there are others, right? I mean, when you can lie to yourself, you can lie to anyone. And so it was really important to me to be able to be honest. And in deciding what to share, there was also a lot of power in deciding what not to share and what to keep for myself. But in deciding what to share, I said, if I'm going to put this out there, I'm going to tell the whole truth as much as I possibly can. So I've wanted this book to be an offering to anyone who has felt, I think, maybe sidelined by a series of events that have happened in their lives and sort of the ways in which they've framed those events as blocks, because we often aren't rewarded for doing that. We're not rewarded for excavating and looking at the scariest, hardest things we've ever been through. But I think ultimately being vulnerable is the only way that you can actually begin to untether yourself and untether your identity from those things, from the things that have happened to you. And so that was both my work and my ongoing practice, and through this book, my offering. And I think that I do feel wiser and softer and also somehow stronger for it. And I think I've been more willing to, I have the capacity to let life touch me as a result. And I think when we do that, everything else becomes more possible, more likely, that spaciousness that comes from telling the truth.
Well, with this idea of telling the truth, I love how you framed it. It's when we have a lie or something, or a resentment, or just some sort of fear that we're holding on to. I read that it's like we're holding the hot coal, and we're only burning ourselves, but yet it's all we know, and so we continue to burn ourselves with this hot coal of something. And it keeps us from that freedom we feel of, like you said, telling the truth. Some of the truths that struck me actually even very early in your book were being very upfront about your mom's addiction, and understanding that addiction is in many families and it's generational. I think that's something that the research has come to recognize, that trauma is generational, but not only is it the emotional trauma, but that emotional trauma can physically manifest itself even at a genetic level. And we can actually genetically pass on trauma to our offspring and future generations. And so that's why it's not enough to just, there was a generation that learned it was okay to cry. There was a generation that learned it was okay to talk about it. But I feel like you're opening the door for that next generation to say, how can this actually be a touchstone of growth? And how can I rewrite the future? Am I putting too many words onto the situation, too much pressure, or is that aligned with maybe a hope or dream you have?
No, that's absolutely right. I love this idea of even what's been passed down, right? So much of my book is about our emotional inheritance and what we choose to carry. Part of my interest in exploring my own story through the lens of neuroscience and psychology was really rooted in that understanding that we don't earn our beginnings. We don't get to choose our origin stories, but we can choose who we become. And I think the science of healing, whether we're talking about neuroplasticity, whether we're talking about epigenetics, which, we're discussing right now, right? This idea that our environment, our behaviors, the people with whom we spend time, and what we've inherited, sort of that genetic material, the combination of those elements can dictate the way in which our genes are expressed, our propensity toward one behavior or another, or the body's willingness to suppress a tendency because it's in what feels like a safe environment, or it's surrounded by people who are nurturing and pouring into you, was so illuminating to me that I felt like I had language to explain how I could say to someone, yes, I grew up in Detroit in the 1980s and 90s. Both of my parents struggled with substance abuse. They weren't together, and my father mostly wasn't in my life, but he does struggle with heroin addiction. My mother had a crack addiction. And yet it is also true. And so we grew up in deep poverty, but it is also true that I did go to the University of Michigan for undergrad and graduated at 20 years old. And then I went to NYU Stern for my MBA at 25. And by 30, I was running a $350 million business at Estee Lauder as a director in the North America business. And people could say, well, I don't understand. How could you come from that and wind up here? How did you become this thing? Epigenetics started to give me some language for how that could happen, how someone could, by being intentional, by having that conscious intervention to disrupt the patterns and the behaviors and the experiences that sort of we're at risk of recreating when we operate out of a habitual state or a more subconscious state, how one could do that. That it wasn't unique to me. I'm not a unicorn. I am not extraordinary, and that there were scientific explorations or explanations for how someone could imagine that path. So it's very fair to say that I would love to see a generation participate in, join the chorus of people helping this generation think about what does it mean to be the one in your family to feel the pain so that it stops.
And as I describe it in my own journey, is the idea of being the dam and understanding that I can't, like you said, you can't control what has come before you. You can't control the situation you're born into, but you can control how that is passed along. And it doesn't necessarily have to be through children. It can just be how you pass along into the world, whether it's, as you write about in your book, your chosen family or the broader world that you engage with. That's really powerful. But when you think about this, when you think about epigenetics and what genetic material is passed on to us, how did you reframe that from a place, or how might someone reframe that from a place of, wow, I've just got a bad hand and I'm always going to be hamstrung by this, to something that I have agency over?
I love this question because it takes me in a couple of places. I think first, just sharing with your listeners the idea of neuroplasticity, which is simply the brain's ability to adapt and change and grow in response to different experiences, to stories, to what we learn. And so the promise of neuroplasticity is that what we learn, we can unlearn. And I think for me, I would argue that I have a tendency, I'm probably more naturally wired for and inclined toward optimism and positivity. But I think when someone is feeling stuck or that the set of circumstances in which they were born and raised are hindering them and they got that bad hand, I would invite them to consider those are facts about your life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the stories that you're telling yourself about those facts are really just interpretations of those events. You get to decide what you do with those facts today. You can lay out the same set of facts and look at what are the stories I tell myself about those facts? And how is that actually showing up in my life? And then you can say, well, what if I actually told myself a different story? What if I had more context? What if I could frame this differently? And I think that comes from a place of radical acceptance. Got to be willing to accept that it happened. And you also have to be willing to believe that you can have a different relationship to those events.
Right. Right. That's what's so challenging I found in my journey is to understand that just the simple difference between was and is, what was and what is. I can't control. I rely on my faith to say, I don't worry about what can be or should be, right? I don't worry about that. But I am in a position where, as you said, I was there's that phrase in psychology, it's sort of pop psychology, but once it's fired, it's wired, the neurons in our brain. And I used to use that as an excuse. Say, well, I can't help it. This is just how it's wired. And so I can't control if it fires down that path. But at the end of the day, we can, as you've talked about, build that muscle, if you will. And it's unfortunate that there are times when I have to talk myself off the same ledge. But then I figure it out. Shouldn't I know better than to walk along that path? But we just need to have that ability and not punish ourselves. I'm speaking maybe from my experience, not punish myself from going back down that path, but just to accept that I may feel naked on this other path, but I'm not at the edge. And if I wasn't supposed to be at the edge, then even though I may feel naked, this is kind of the path I'm supposed to be on. What about you? How did you make that transition in your life?
I think allowing myself the grace to and the compassion to see the awareness of the habit and the pattern part of the process. Right. So having a fearful thought or having a moment of despair or concern that something will always be this way and realizing that I'm having the thought at all, realizing that, oh, you're thinking that again. And then sort of giving myself the gold star to say, look, you heard yourself, you clocked it. I happen to use journaling as an exercise to give myself the space for that witnessing, that testimony, because I can then sort of create some distance from it living in my brain and in my body. And then I can sort of observe it with a little bit less judgment, more objectivity. And then I can start to say, okay. Well, again, if step 1 is awareness, then step 2 is radical acceptance. And step 3 says, what does it look like to disrupt the pattern that I'm in? That literally could just be play a song. Right? Shift gears. It could be go for a walk. It could be call a friend. It could be do 10 jumping jacks, right? That's your business. And I do all of those are options for me. It could be, okay, I need you to just sit down and meditate for 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
But honoring that and saying, okay, what can I do to disrupt the pattern? Sometimes it's the real-time pattern disruption that we need. That's what conscious intervention looks like to me. And then you can start to move into a place of the sort of reframing over time. That might be where you say, okay, I feel like I'm getting tripped up on the same set of facts. The cast of characters is different. My wardrobe is different. The set of facts keeps showing up, right? Like, and somehow I'm recreating the same movie over and over again. Okay, how might the ending look different?
I love that. How might it look different? Yeah.
It is. And I think that what I'll sort of end that by saying is I try to think about possibility and not probability, because When we're in a mindset of focusing on the probability of an outcome, we're projecting things onto it and we're using past information, experiences, fear, anxiety. You're putting all of that on top of an outcome and you actually don't have any idea. And so if you sort of took off the probability hat, which is operating from a risk tolerance place at fear, rightful, righteous sometimes, but nonetheless, and you said, okay, but what are all the other ways this could go?
Right.
This could actually go a lot of different ways.
Yes.
And by the way, I actually can't even list all the ways this actually could go.
Amazing.
What if I just let myself be surprised? I think that is sort of the mantra. Just let myself be surprised and trust that my magnetism will bring the right things in and the right people in, and that my clear next steps will be made for me. I will have clarity around that because I trust my discernment, but I don't need to constantly walk around sort of emotionally hijacked by things that happened 30, 40 years ago. I can actually provide, again, that is equation. I really love that thinking. I think to me, that's what the walk looks like. And it's not every day I'm choosing it, but often I'm showing up and saying, okay, no, it's time to disrupt the instinct to want this to feel familiar, even if what's familiar is harmful.
At the Berkeley Innovation Group, we are a strategy consultancy and AI advisory firm focused on mid-market companies looking to unlock big growth. In contrast to management consultants' typical top-down, hypothesis-driven approach, Big uses a curiosity-inspired, bottom-up approach, leveraging customer insights to drive strategy co-creation. Learn more about our approach by downloading our ebook at biginnovates.com/ebook. Now, back to the show.
Well, welcome back. And we're in the middle of just a beautiful and heartfelt discussion with Daria Burke and her memoir, talking about moving beyond the past and setting an intention for the future. And as executives, I've heard that as executives, we're really just children in bigger bodies. If I were to go back to the playground and see these folks interact with their classmates, even at a young age, a lot of those personality traits would still come through. And that helps me when, as you talked about anxiety and fear, and I joke that those are they're two of my four big food groups. And I just remind myself that fear stands for false evidence appearing real. And I say, let's just go back to the playground. And if we were at the playground, what would this be? And it helps me lower the stakes. It's almost an attempt at first principles from my perspective to just say, look, we're all just people. We all put our pants on one leg at a time and to move forward from there. But moving forward from these events the word is, and you label it as a heavy label, and I appreciate the heaviness of the word survivor or survival. And so short of, if I had the rights, I would dub over, I'm a survivor. But we're not going to do that here. We're just going to let you go from there. So what's your feeling about this word survivor and the weight of that? Or is it empowering?
I think my relationship to it continues to change. For many years, I wouldn't have even used it in the context of my life experience. Then when I began to use it, or it began to be used to describe me, I found myself bristling at it. I didn't like what it did in my body, and it did feel very heavy. It felt like that meant that I was somehow still having to carry everything that I had gone through. That sure, I had been through it, but that there was a burden of proof that you had made it somehow. I also feel so much like this book was actually a more of a reassembly, kind of a reclamation of all the selves that I had to shed in order to get out of Detroit and to get through the family that I was born into. And so I think that the survivor idea, that label, people forget that that's so much of what has to happen that so much of that work, that trudging beyond the challenge, means that I'm leaving a lot behind. I'm having to sacrifice a lot. And I think that no one really accounts for the person that's left after that and what needs to get put back in, and so much of the work, I think, for me in the journey leading up to the book and then the book itself, writing it and speaking about it, has been this kind of remembering. Because to rejoin and reconnect and sort of remember. And so there is the cognitive remembering, and then there's the sort of physical somatic remembering, but there's kind of this actual reattachment and remembering of all of these. And so survival always to me felt like a reminder of all the things that I had to leave and let go of, that I couldn't make space for, carrying ahead. And so I think it's felt so loaded. And so I feel understanding of the label, but I still wish that there was more recognition when people say that, what they're implying.
It can be an easy label in the sense that in the Western context, particularly in an American context, this thing happened, but I'm okay now.
Yes.
This happened, but I'm okay.
Yes.
And the term survivor can be used as a catch-all for that, but I'm okay now. And we'll talk about this idea of post-traumatic growth as you get into after the diagnosis of, in your case, a more complex PTSD. But that growth it's one thing for me to say I've emotionally made progress. But I found there was a separate piece of it that was I had to physically make progress. And I was talking to someone just in our family, and he made the comment. He was like, yeah, I felt this little area of fat. And so I just kind of worked out and did cleanse to cleanse this area of fat. And I was like, you have that ability? That's amazing. But specifically, he was saying, yeah, because that's my body telling me I'm holding on to something that I should let go. And I said, oh, okay, this is interesting. And so I looked at myself and I said, well, what is my body representing just in its shape or form that I'm holding that I have to let go? And this get me down. There'll be a whole other episode about, functional medicine to go along with just how stress and trauma negatively impacts our body and our health. But with that being said, when you let go of that stress, my body went through a pretty violent reaction to actually letting go of something that was bad, right?
Yes.
And so for me, I'm really connecting that back to what you shared so beautifully is that, yeah, being a survivor isn't just getting out of on the other side. It's being mindful of the emotional journey, yes, but other parts of that journey that people go through. And there's no coming out the other side of this. You can build new and progress, but coming out the other side isn't just it's not like a car wash.
Right.
What would you say about that from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there is another side, right? An other side. That's right. You're not the same person on the other side of it. And the expectation that things will go back to the way that they were, I think, is how a lot of people stay stuck and where they can struggle to find healing. The thing that I was most excited, I think, to write about and to talk about was post-traumatic growth, because it was a phenomenon that was labeled by two psychologists in maybe 30-something years ago at this point. And interestingly enough, it has yet to really make its way into the zeitgeist, certainly not the way that PTSD has. But it's a really beautiful and simple description of a phenomenon that many people who go through traumatic events experience, where they report having gone through that experience, and after some unmeasurable, undetermined amount of time, but through that acceptance, through that reframe, through making meaning of what happened, through even finding benefit perhaps to what happened, and doing that in a supportive community with people around you, those people have consistently reported a greater appreciation for life, a stronger sense of well-being, greater spiritual sense, better relationships, more resilient. And so it's not that you can have in my case, a complex PTSD diagnosis, which for me happened in my mid to late 20s, having lived through sustained traumatic events for the first 22 years of my life. And still come out on the other side through that process that I described, having also been able to report, gosh, I do feel like I have a stronger sense of possibility in my life. I have a great appreciation for things. I actually show up better in my relationships, that everything that I went through, I allowed that to be a portal where I could transmute that pain, those stories, the interpretation of those events, and render that into something that may be unrecognizable, but that looks something like growth, that feels something like healing. And so when I learned about this idea of post-traumatic growth, all the bells went off, but also my deep desire to figure out, well, what does it look like to scale that knowledge and help people understand that, I dare say, ingredients for how this can look and come together. I can promise that we all have the possibility for post-traumatic growth. I can't promise we'll all go through it, and I can't promise that it will look linear and that I could predict the ways in which it would kind of unfold, but that the possibility exists. And so that, I think, when you can, again, have an imagination for your life that looks something like, it doesn't have to look like this. It doesn't have to look like this. Then you can start to figure out, again, that what might it look like, and what are the mechanisms that can help me move to sort of the air quote, the other side.
I don't want to draw a connection where it doesn't exist. So please, correct me if this doesn't land, but I feel as though you're this innate belief in a better way, my words, but possibility is your word. Looking back on your career, has that optimism or that belief, even it was buried under some, to use personal words, BS, right? Like, I got my stuff, but underneath all my stuff, there's like, I am a possibilities person.
Yes.
Did that come out in your career, even subconsciously?
Yeah, I think all the leaps that I made in my career, I learned by leaping, generally speaking.
Ooh.
And I do. I'm
beautiful.
And so I rewarded myself for that. I never judged myself for that. And it allowed me to be in a role or work through a project. And I also found that I was being hired for impact type of work. And so generally I was coming in and helping to redefine something that needed to be reimagined, or creating something where it didn't exist. And I think that sort of momentum that I was creating for myself and continuing to choose roles and then doing well in those roles, I was also building that trust muscle and that confidence muscle. But I think, the funny thing is, and I dare not talk about imposter syndrome. I'm happy to, but I don't believe in it. But what I will say is that I always believed in my ability to do something, despite where I grew up, despite how I grew up, despite having absolutely nothing and many of my basic needs unmet for most of my early life. I never doubted my ability to do things. So I don't know where that comes from. I could hazard a guess. But it absolutely, therefore, allowed me to believe that a poor Black girl from Detroit could do almost anything, that I could go to business school, having been a literature major who worked in the architecture and interior design industry and knew nothing about an MBA or corporate finance or accounting or anything, that I could go to a place like Columbia or NYU. I chose NYU. And that I could launch a career that would allow me to sort of shoelace through these blue chip and early stage companies and take a bunch of leaps and risks, knowing that I had myself to sort of fall back on. If it didn't work out, it was still going to be fine. There's something weird about that for me that I'm really sort of into. And that's probably other things about me. But yeah, that's a long way of saying that, yeah, I've always had the sense that I can try anything. I think if anything, my tolerance for getting it wrong and for being a beginner has just increased and allowed me to take bigger swings as a result, because I've got a decent track record of doing all right when I yeah.
Going back to your book, and not to spoil the ending, but when you have your grandmother's lap as part of your story, it's easier to leap. I'm maybe projecting some of my own experience there, but when I was reading that part of your book, I don't know if you ever heard the Bill Withers song, Grandma's Hands.
Oh, yes. I love that song.
Right? Yeah. Listen to that and don't cry, right?
Mm-hmm. And many years I couldn't listen to it without losing it.
Right.
Yes.
But then it has a spiritual element to it, right? Because it is kind of sung in a spiritual way, and it's a source of strength. And so not many people would list that as one of their like top 3 songs, but it's such a beautiful source of strength for me, and it means a lot. And so I know that to kind of wrap up our conversation, at the end of your book and connecting the journaling that you talked about earlier, you shared a really powerful moment at the end of your book. And so, obviously the entire book is worth the read. So I don't think we're spoiling anything by sharing this story, but tell us about one of those, the importance of your grandmother, and then that very impactful journaling session that you had.
Yes. Well, I will start by saying that I'm such a pattern spotter that
beautiful.
I remember it must have been 7 years ago, maybe at this point, that the first 7 years of a child's life are so fundamental to cementing, which I hesitated to use that word because that doesn't mean it's permanent, but really creating a foundational set of beliefs. Almost sort of your nervous system gets tuned to a certain note.
I mean, to my earlier comment, once it's fired, it's wired. I mean,
that's right.
There is a little bit of that.
It's true, right? And neuroplasticity really just is the way of explaining that those constant exposures, but in those early years, we're forming neural connections at such a rapid rate that it's that particular time frame where it becomes so fundamental to our capacity to do more later. And I had her for the first 7 years of my life. And it hadn't dawned on me that was sort of the magic number, if you will. And when I first heard that, I was like, oh my gosh, that's part of it. That has to be part of it. And particularly when I have learned about the level of neglect that I experienced from my mother and how early it began, it made sense that grandma was such a foundational force and structural force, emotionally, physically, financially, and really in all the ways. So for, I think, all the years that I didn't fully grieve the loss of her passing when I was 7 years old, I think there was a little bit of a disconnection from her spirit. I think she was always there and guiding my life, but I don't know that I always had the evidence. And I began to create a little bit more room over time and sort of allowing her presence to be felt in my life. But it wasn't until the event that I write about in chapter 1 where I was confronted again with her death in a way that opened me up and forced me to look at all the things I thought I knew about my life and my childhood and the healing that I had done. That I think really made way for her to show up in my life in full force, right? And so then I had to see her, sort of literally see her name everywhere. And it was just kind of like this opening that had happened. And so the journal exercise that I write about, it was a meditation that I had done that was really about connecting with the ancestors, your ancestors. And in the meditation, I'm sort of walking into a forest and, the sun, sort of straight into a beam of sunlight and really making myself available to whoever was going to come through. Some days I'm like, maybe it'll be Toni Morrison, maybe it'll be Maya Angelou. Maybe it'll be my grandmother. And,
I mean, I am an author, just saying, right?
Yeah. I mean, listen, and I say ancestors broadly. I use that term really broadly. Sure. As a Black woman in particular, but I was really fortunate to be visited by her in one of those moments. It was the only time it's happened. I am never lucky enough to dream about her. She doesn't come to me in my dreams. She's always come to me in sort of these other cosmic ways, so to speak. And so to have her presence and to have the assurance that I will always have questions about my life, and I will always wonder, I think to some degree, what having a longer life under her care could have meant, that she's still here and that I'm very much in her care, and that my hands are still very much held by hers. And it was really so powerful. And so I generally feel the closest to her when I am, and I should say, in finishing that thought, coming out of the meditation, just free writing everything that was coming up for me, and realizing that there was a point in the writing where it was her voice and she was talking to me through the writing. And then there was a moment where it just stopped, and then I'm writing again. And sort of that channeling of, I think, that wisdom, that knowing, that love, it lives so deep in all of us. And it's sort of this like woo-woo mystical moment that I had, that I debated if it belonged in the book, because it was so science forward, but it was so honest, and I couldn't help but include it. And I feel the closest to her still when I'm gardening and when I'm pruning my hydrangea bushes and in the yard and doing yard work, and my hands are in the dirt. There's something about that ritual that we shared when I was really little.
Yeah, I was going to say she taught you that.
That she did, and that connection back to it. I think just that sort of, it's almost like a prayer in a lot of ways when I find myself literally on my knees and the hands in the dirt, that I can sort of bring her back to me.
That's wonderful. We're blessed to have the openness to accept that even though someone's not here, they're with us. And a lot of executives feel as though their positions aren't earned if they haven't done it themselves. But anyone with any level of success will tell you that a few bridges were laid out for them along their path. And your grandmother was clearly that for you. And I can certainly say that, my ancestors have laid that out for me. And it's easy. I think that's what my closing thought is. It's easy to look to the past as excuses for the present. But when and I'm using your word, find the possibilities in the past and extrapolate them forward, and not just physically like a financial asset, but just that intangible that you have, right? I mean, who knows? Maybe your mother or father never maybe manifest that emotion the same way you did, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't there. Drugs and alcohol are a terrible way to calm the voices that we hear, whether they're real or imagined. And it can really snuff out what could be a bright flame. But you've, again, only through hard work, have come out and been such a great example of what can be. And for those listeners who are still listening and realize that is scary, just what advice would you give to those folks who think there's a there, but might be scared to take that step?
I want to very briefly acknowledge something that you said that I think feeds into my response to that question, because we were talking about epigenetics, and epigenetics, if epigenetics tells us that we can inherit trauma from our ancestors, it also means that we can inherit their wisdom, that we can inherit the good things. So I think remembering that is so important. And I think knowing that you can survive your feelings is the other thing. And so if you can allow yourself to feel it, that's really the first step. I'll share an analogy that I've used, and I imagine a lot of your listeners are very physically active. I love Pilates, but I also love SoulCycle. And if you've ever done SoulCycle, there's a moment in the class where you grab a pair of weights from the side of the bike, and you have just like a song worth of weights that where you're lifting, and usually, they're 2, 3, 5 pounds. But after a while, even those 3-pound weights get quite heavy. And there's a part sometimes where you're lifting, you're holding your arms straight out in front of you, and, you're just meant to hold it for a little while. Start to feel that tension in your wrists and your elbows, maybe in your shoulders, your back starts to get a little bit tight. And then the moment that you get some relief and you can bring those weights back in close to you, you notice how you can move differently with those same 3 pounds. I think of integration and healing and growth and feeling your feelings like that. It's the moment that you bring them close, you can figure out how now I can move my body differently with this. And so it's not going to be by holding it out as far as I can away from myself. It's going to be pulling it close and understanding how to move with it, that I'm actually going to be stronger and changed. And so I would leave your listeners with that idea that if you can imagine a world that you can pull it closer to you, and that I can assure you that you will survive what you feel when you do that. Everything else is glorious.
That's the perfect note to land this plane, as I like to say. Daria, this has just been phenomenal. Thank you. Your openness, I know has resonated with me, will resonate with others. Clearly, the first step in this process is to look for your book of my own making, wherever books are sold. But in this case, tell us a little bit more, just to wrap up, what's your next mission or passion or vector, whatever word you want to use to describe it? Where has all of this intentionality pointed you today?
Well, I'm still so active in the touring process. I've got 3 events coming up in the next 3 weeks, and then more into the fall. But I would say big picture, I'm already starting to think about book number 2 and starting to field a lot of calls to come in and speak and lead workshops around innovation and possibility thinking. And that's really fun. So that's what my short and sort of medium term looks like right now. But it's been thrilling. And honestly, I'm sort of just open to all the ways in which I'll be shown what the next steps are for me to take.
And that is the definition of possibility. Wonderful. Well, we will put links to all relevant information in the show notes, LinkedIn, etc., where folks can follow you and find out if and when you're speaking in their town, and the chance to do that. And I'll be in New York in September, so I can only hope that it aligns with your travel schedule and we'll have the chance to connect.
Oh, I'd love that. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Daria.
Thank you.